live. Okay, letting everybody get in here to our webinar. I'd like to say welcome to our 6th issue of Cal's Conversations. I'm Will Reese, the director of Cal's and founder and partner at Next Level Sports. We've got a big group today, so a lot of people that might not be familiar with Cal's that have learned about today's webinar on Twitter. To let you know a little bit about Cal's, we're a networking and professional development event for college athletics administrator. If you're interested in learning more about what we do, it's at adsymposium.us, adsymposium.us. Gonna let this group populate for a little bit longer. Okay, so for those of you in the Cal's community, gotten a lot of questions about the plan for Cal's for this year, which is set for New Orleans. And keep track of us on Twitter at AD Symposium. We will release our plans for that in the next few weeks. So a couple questions that we've gotten recently about, do we record or are we recording these sessions? Yes, we have all of our Cal's Conversations, including today, recorded. We're in the process of putting those up on our website. So we will tweet that out when that's ready, so everybody can go to their to our website, adsymposium.us, and be able to watch. There's actually will be 5, because one of them was our Cal's Path that was individual breakouts. So be on the lookout for that as well. So as we approach our topic today, you know, the last couple of weeks and the last few months of our country has been historic times, to say the least. As we've all, as a country, processed the senseless murder of George Floyd, and all the conversations and all the protests and the things that have come out of that, I know personally, as I've processed that through prayer and reading and just learning everything that I can, I've just come up with this sense that the thing that people don't need to hear my 2 cents right now. That what's for me is I need to listen and learn, and then what I need to do from that is I need to let those things lead me to action. The first step that I personally can take in that is using what platforms we've created, you know, over the past 13 years, the Next Level and last decade with Cal's, to hopefully have frank and important conversations about topics of, you know, racial equity and equality, social justice, and, you know, all these things that are on the front of our minds. Unfortunately, throughout history, it's taken tragic events to spur movements forward. And I believe that's where we are today. The lead to action right now, it looks for me, is using this platform. And before we get started with our panel, I want to spotlight some people in my orbit that are doing great things. First, I want to talk about hashtag All Vote No Play. And you all have probably seen this on Twitter. There's been a lot out there with this. It was started by Eric Reveneau at Georgia Tech, associate head basketball coach, with one tweet. And that is to, you know, wanting the NCAA to mandate that federal election day, November 3rd, becomes a mandatory day off for NCAA athletics. What's been amazing is to see how this has taken off. Several universities, several conferences have followed suit and said, we're going to do this. We're going, in the next few minutes, I'm going to tweet out a petition that Eric started that they're going to present to the NCAA. And talking to Eric, what they want to see done is have this be mandated on the NCAA calendar. So it's not just a one-year deal, that it's a deal moving forward on these important election days, and encouraging our student athletes to be involved, and then modeling that through this legislation. So whatever channels you have to support this, or if it's just sign the petition, I know that Eric and everybody involved with this would be very appreciative and think it's make a big difference. Another thing I'd like to highlight is Coaches Coalition for Progress. There's been a lot tweeted and written on this as well. Started by assistant coach at Oklahoma, basketball coach Carlin Hartman, along with Todd Golden from University of San Francisco, and a few other coaches I'm leaving off. You can check them out at coachescoalitionforprogress.org. And they've got a big plan to do some great things with the youth in helping disadvantaged areas, and just a lot of great things under plan. So be sure to check out their website and check them out. So that brings us to how we've gotten here today. So as I was processing and going through this, talking to my daughters about it, and all that's going on in our world, I'm sure most of us on here have seen Tim's Twitter video that he put out a few weeks ago. And I'll have to say that was a very powerful thing for me, in that, I'm lucky to be friends with Tim. Tim and I have gotten to know each other through Cal's. He's been to, 6-7 times, and I've been able to see him go from a Division II AD to Division I deputy to now Division I AD, in the span that he has been with us. And so Tim and I hit it off immediately. We've got a lot of things in common. We're close to the same age. Tim has got a few years on me, but we're within range. We're both 6'8", so he's one of the few people I can literally see eye to eye with. We're both basketball players. Tim was a lot better than I was. Both work in college athletics, have a passion, for serving and helping others. And so, first thought I had when I watched Tim's Twitter video is that I just had a lot of respect for Tim showing the courage to put himself out there like that. It's not the easy thing to do, and we've all seen in the media, stories written about it, and the retweets. It's affected a lot of people. But for me, all these things that I knew in my head, it moved to my heart, because all these things that Tim and I have in common, I know this is something we don't. And I know this is something, walking down the street to Whole Foods with my wife, I don't have to worry about an incident like that happened to me. Our backgrounds are different. And so I called Tim and I said how much I appreciated him putting that out there, and that, I wanted to use whatever platform we have to help further this conversation. And so thank you so much. For Tim is the one that got the topic, brought in Brandy. Brandy's done a lot of work on this to get us prepared. Very grateful for all of you. Candace, very grateful you being here. I just told her it was before we got on that it was super smooth time to become an AD for the first time. Calm waters, easy sailing out there. So really excited for you to be with us, Candace. Derrick, I should have just had you drive over. We should have done it from my house, over here in the Cal studio. But I think that we've had over 700 people register to be on here, and so that's awesome. We've got everybody from conference commissioners to Division Power 5 ADs to athletic directors, senior associates, student athletes, coaches, interns. So the whole spectrum are here. And I don't know that we're going to solve the world's problems today on this webinar, but I do think it's an important step to start the conversation. And I hope the people watching will have it spur something within you where you can see the world from somebody else's perspective, and start to really educate yourself. And maybe it'll spur you to start a conversation with somebody in your world, in your orbit. And I think as these conversations take place, that's how we'll continue to move forward. And they'll cover a lot of ground. They'll be helpful in talking to your coaches, your staff, your student athletes, and on your campus. But, most importantly, it's a human issue. And I'm so glad that we get to use our platform for this today. I would like at this point to introduce Brandy Stewart. Brandy is the Executive Associate Athletic Director in SWA at Central Florida. Brandy has been with us to Cal's recently, as everybody else has been on the panel, and we appreciate you all being with us there and being a part of our community. Brandy was the first minority female, Black female senior associate AD at Florida State, and is currently the first executive associate AD in SWA, Black female at University of Central Florida. So at this point, Brandy, I'm going to hand it over to you to get started with our panel.
Thank you, Will. And before we introduce the panel, I just, on behalf of all of us and the folks that are watching, all 700 of you, thank you for being an ally. Thank you for being a friend. And thank you for providing this very powerful platform and much needed conversation, as we can tell from all the people that have joined us today. So I didn't want to forget to just say thank you, because in all of this, what we all have been saying is we need allies, and you are one of them, and you are using your national platform for us to do this. So greatly appreciated. As we get into our topic of is social justice the new diversity, equity, and inclusion, we've got three very influential athletic directors, Division I athletic directors joining us. I'm going to start with ladies first. So I will first be introducing Dr. Candace Lee. She was the first Black female deputy athletic director at Vanderbilt, and as we all know and have celebrated very recently, the first Black African American female athletic director at Vanderbilt and in the SEC. So welcome and congratulations to you again, Candace. Next, we have Dr. Derrick Gragg, who was the first Black male senior associate and then deputy at the University of Arkansas, and is now serving in his 7th year as the first Black male athletic director at Tulsa. So thank you very much, Derrick, for being here. And then lastly, we have Tim Duncan, as Will mentioned, who was the catalyst for this discussion. So first, thank you for being very vulnerable and sharing your story with the world. That has had a ripple effect. So we really appreciate you doing that and sharing your story. Tim was the first African-American male as an executive director of the Seahawk Club at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. He was also the first African-American male as the athletic director at Clayton State, the first African-American male as the deputy AD at Northeastern University, and is now serving, rounding out your first year, a little bit past your first year, Tim, as the first African-American male as the AD at New Orleans. So let's get into it and let's get started. We thought that it might be beneficial for the viewers to be able to hear a little bit more about you, who you are, and how race and racism has impacted your life. So Candace, if you don't mind, or excuse me, we're gonna start with the most relevant story that we've got that's out there in the stratosphere right now. We're gonna start with you, Tim. So I know that you shared your video, but if you could share with us why this is important to you and give us how race has impacted you as a man, as an administrator, as a father, whatever you're willing to share, we'd appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Brandy, I appreciate it. Thank you again, Will, for this opportunity. All those first just reminds me that I just turned 50. So that is not lost on me that I'm getting a little bit older, but it's still a privilege to serve in that capacity in so many places. So as many of you have seen, 5 days before George Floyd was killed, I was in an incident where police stopped me with guns drawn as my wife and I were walking to Whole Foods. And we all know what types of neighborhood that Whole Foods are in, and they usually have great food and are safe goods, right? So our house distance between Whole Foods and Trader Joe's. So we, on that day, decided to go to Whole Foods, and we were stopped. Police surrounded us very quickly and aggressively, and one had his gun drawn directly on me. and asked me the typical questions. Where are you going? First, put your hands on your head. Where are you going? Where you live? And those types of questions. And although the incident ended pretty quickly, it, 3.5, 4 minutes, I think was the official time. It felt like a lot longer when you're staring down the barrel of a gun. And unfortunately, that wasn't the first time that a police officer had drawn a gun on me. It had happened before, just at traffic stops, when they see who's driving and approach with a gun out of their holster in their hands when approaching. So the thing that sparked the videos, I wanted to use it for a learning moment for our student athletes, but it was just, why had I normalized those situations? And it really didn't hit me until George Floyd was murdered. And one of my friends said, Tim, that could have been you. That it really hit me that I should be upset and more outraged and try to do something to change that. So that was the most recent, and the response has been overwhelming. I hadn't looked in a while, but I know it was over 22,000 people had seen the video on YouTube. So that's somewhat overwhelming, and interviews from everywhere and calls and acknowledgments from friends. Many of you are here today watching this video. So I appreciate the thoughts and the well wishes. And as I've told several people, if substantial change comes out of my incident, then I'd sign up for again today, because it's so worth it to have people having these conversations and to have a platform like this on Cal's Conversation. So thanks, Brandy, for giving me a chance to go first.
Thank you, Tim. Next, we'll hear from Candace. Candace, if you don't mind sharing a story that you've experienced with racism and racial injustice.
Sure. And I also want to thank Cal's and everybody on the panel, and Tim, especially you, for having the courage to share your story. And I think it really gave a lot of us the courage to have conversations that maybe perhaps we were having before, but just more of an impetus to affect change using our voice and our platform. And I think sometimes as Black leaders, sometimes that's more than a notion. That can be challenging in so many different ways. So I really appreciate that. I would say it really resonated with me what Tim said about normalizing situations, because I think that we have these kinds of things happen so much that in some ways you become desensitized, which is so inappropriate. But I guess for me, I'll just quickly share one story. Very, very recently during football season at Vanderbilt, and if you know me, you know I've been at Vanderbilt for more than half of my life. So I've been in Nashville and on that campus a long time. And I was, at this time, I'm in the role of, as a deputy AD, and I had gone up to our suite level to talk to some donors. And I walked in, and there was a patron. There was someone up there who saw me and immediately told me that the bathrooms needed to be restocked, and wanted to make sure that I knew that they needed more toilet tissue in there. And it was such a, it's so strange for me that was the only way that this person could make sense of me being in that space. And so it didn't matter that I've been there since I was 17. It didn't matter that I had 3 degrees from there. It didn't matter that I've been on that campus for so much time. It did not make sense to her. And again, I would just say those kinds of things happen all the time. They happen all the time. And I'm so glad that we're talking more about it, because we shouldn't normalize it.
Thank you, Candace. I bet if you had that patron's Twitter handle when your announcement came out as the athletic director at Vanderbilt, you could have just mentioned her in like a "how you like me now" kind of tweet. But you're probably not that petty, but I probably. Thank you for sharing. And last but not least, Dr. Derrick Gragg.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Will, and everybody on the panel. And I've been in tons of these conversations the past couple of weeks, as like a lot of you on the call, sometimes we're the lone Black face in the room. So we get called upon to do a lot of things. I was on a call yesterday with 4 very prominent men of color who are in the police force all across the country. And it's amazing to hear them talk about the bad run-ins that they'd had with police before they became who they are now. So it happens all the time. It's very prevalent. Something for me that's a little bit more subtle that some of you may experience is that my president, our interim president, lives around the street. She's a white female, and everyone's trapped in the house right now, obviously. And so what she's been doing to kind of unwind in the evenings is take walks with people on the staff. And she asked me to take a walk with her a couple of weeks ago. And unless you're someone like me, you wouldn't understand the hesitation that I had doing that. And my wife and I talked about that for a long time because, one, perception, the neighborhood, walking around with a white woman, what are you doing with her? We still have people who run up on us in cars that or walking when we're in the neighborhood asking us, do we live in the neighborhood? They're nice about it, but we know what that means. I do not run in the neighborhood. I do not allow my sons to run in the neighborhood unless they are wearing Tulsa gear, because at least that way some people can identify with us. Some people will recognize us as, oh, that's the family, that's the athletic director, those are his kids. But otherwise, when I talk, I present myself first as a Black man because that's how people see me and that's how people see us. And so again, I appreciate the fact that she sees me as a peer and felt very comfortable doing that. But it put me in a very vicarious situation. And we've talked about that since then. We talked about that with our staff, the leadership staff, and I'm very proud of her with the responses that she's had. But those types of things happen all the time.
Thank you, Derrick. And thank you everybody for sharing your stories. I think it's a great way to start this conversation and reminding folks that racism doesn't discriminate. As I'm talking to people and they're trying to learn or get some understanding of what's going on, I hear a lot of like, oh, I never really thought that you would have to deal with that given your job and where you live and how you act and carry yourself. And I just try to tell them that, racism doesn't discriminate, y'all. So it's powerful to hear that as athletic directors, you are facing this even every day. And so I appreciate you sharing the story that's important for you and has impacted you in your life. We're gonna shift a little bit and go back to the title of our discussion, asking if social justice is the new diversity, inclusion, and equity. And, a lot of times I think we confuse all of these things. There was a time when diversity, equity, and inclusion was super sexy. And so people really wanted to be a part of that and have that as a movement. And so, for the sake of this conversation, we thought it was really important to differentiate between the 4 different concepts, well, really 5 if we include equality. So very quickly, just to run through these. So, diversity is basically the acknowledgement and value of the differences of each individual and takes into account individuals' personalities. So that's when we talk about diversity, we all know that we're trying to find folks from different origins, sexual orientations, disabilities, genders, race. So trying to do some of those things to encompass diversity there. When we talk about this idea and concept of equity, we look at providing individuals with the resources and support that they need to overcome barriers or reach a threshold. It's catering to each individual need, but I like this definition because it points out that this is only fair when there are enough of those resources to go around. Next, we have inclusion. So the idea of inclusion is the process of creating an environment that only recognizes and appreciates the talents, skills, and perspectives of every individual and uses those skills to reach educational and organizational objectives. And I thought it was important to bring that definition from the NCAA, since that's the governing body for most of us and the work that we do. So thought that was very interesting there. When we talk about equality and social justice, so looking at those definitions there, we've got here equality as providing everyone the same resources and support to overcome a barrier or a threshold. Again, keeping in mind though, that it's only fair if everyone starts from the same point. And then lastly, we have social justice. So social justice is the view that everyone deserves equal economic, political, social rights and opportunities. And so there we're talking about access, opportunity, and then just that, the thought about everybody deserving that equal access is, I think what really stands out for me when I look at social justice and that definition. So the question that, we're posing to this panel is social justice the new diversity, equity, and inclusion? So Candace, I think we'll start with you. What are your thoughts there?
I've been thinking a lot about this question. I think, so as I've had conversations with a couple of people too, I think part of the challenge that we have is that when we've talked before about, and I think with very good intentions about diversity and equity and inclusion, I think I understand that we've not always felt comfortable talking about race as a very, very specific component of that. And so I think what happens in the past is that there's conversations around being colorblind, and we don't see color, we don't understand that, we're just trying to give everybody equal opportunity and access. But if we don't discuss the racial component, I'm not sure that we can really get to the outcome that I think all of us are seeking, right? And part of that is grappling with how, as a country, we have dealt with race as a social construct, what that means, how we use it divisively. And so I think the shift to social justice does give us, and I suppose this is the intent, give us the opportunity to talk about race in ways that I don't know we have felt comfortable to do in the past. And so I think that shift is probably what we need to acknowledge, and I think it's necessary. And I'm really interested also in just hearing from Tim and Derrick about this, because that's my thought. It's like all of a sudden, I think it does feel all of a sudden to some degree, we have some comfort in discussing race and really how we got here and then where we go from here.
And I'll add to that, and I look at it as a stair-stepped approach. Diversity to me is really a tolerance level. We all have to have diversity in a department. We have to have a senior woman administrator. We have Black kids on some of these teams, so we need to make sure that we have at least maybe some Black coaches and those types of things. Inclusion is different, because inclusion means that you're really welcome to the party. And are you really involved in everything that's going on? Equity goes a little bit further. For me, it's more of, is everything in the department available to you? Can an African-American be involved as the CFO? Can they be involved on the money side of things, the business office, marketing, or are they pigeonholed in a lot of places where, and I started in compliance and academics, and some of the rest of us were, but we were able to work ourselves out of that. So maybe there's some equity there. Social justice transcends all of that. And to me, it's more about how you're judged ultimately outside of the athletic department. Social justice means, quite simply, when you look at what just happened to George Floyd, and in taking them 4 days to arrest the people who were responsible for this and longer, if you just switch the races of those people, and we talk about this all the time, in our backroom conversations, Black people talk about it all the time. What if that victim had been a white man? What would have been the response to that, particularly if those police officers had been Black? And so when I look at social justice, I look at equal treatment.
Yeah, and I'll jump in here to kind of round off this topic. First, I have a very diverse executive team, and I'm really fortunate that I have 2 African-American females, 2 white males, and 1 young Dominican-American, super talented administrator too. So I posed this question to them last week, and we had a fascinating conversation. And my thought is that diversity, equity, and inclusion is a current fight that we're all still fighting. However, social justice is the terminology that our student athletes are using. That's what they know. That's what Black Lives Matter really focuses on. So while all of it is important, absolutely, social justice brings in a historical perspective that we didn't all start in the same place. And there's one very powerful video that talks about playing Monopoly. And if we all played Monopoly and we played 400 rounds of Monopoly, and I was not able to keep my money or my houses 400 rounds, and then the next 50 rounds, when I start to make some money, then you take it or you drop bombs on it, like in Tulsa where Will and Derrick are sitting. And then Now we're starting the game at round 451, and we are giving equitable treatment. Well, we're in a hole, and we haven't learned we've missed the grind to get to that process of learning and owning property and all of that. So I think social justice and racial equality is the fight that we all need to take up, and also with our student athletes, that's the terminology they use. And I'm afraid if we don't include social justice with those other terms, then we're going to miss a whole generation, and they're going to think we're just old stogies and not up for the fight.
Thank you, everyone. And Tim, I've seen that video too. It's pretty powerful from beginning to end. Some colorful language,
Yes.
but the point gets across, and it is actually worth the watch. So in hearing all of you talk, and to clarify for the people that are listening, we're not discounting one or the other, right? We're not trading one for the other, but you're right. There has been and continues to be a movement for this diversity and inclusion. It's kind of the tool that pushes administrators, presidents, athletic directors to look outside of the box and make sure that they're at least having diverse pools and thinking about who they're hiring, being intentional about who they're hiring. But the social justice, to the points that you all have made, is really the action, right? Of like, yes, we've checked these boxes. Yes, we have a diverse group of people, hopefully, on our staffs and our coaching staffs, but what are we actually doing to understand how other areas might be impacted by injustice or by race or by socioeconomic status? So I'm with y'all in that social justice is the action. And I don't know about you, but I've been energized by the student athletes and their responses on our campuses. They truly do give me some hope that this is the generation that really doesn't care what the opinions of other people are about being politically correct. They want to be right, and they want people to be treated as people. So if the student athletes that are on here today, thank you, and keep fighting, keep showing up, keep standing, and bring your friends with you. So we know that as we talk through things, and as administrators, we're solving problems every single day. The first step in solving a problem, though, is being able to see it. We can't fix or we can't solve what we don't see. So how are each of you clarifying the problem for your administrators and your coaches in your department so that everybody understands why there's such public outrage over the deaths of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and George Floyd here in the recent months? Derrick, why don't we start with you?
Absolutely. The first thing that's key and critical, and I will pass along to, in particular, the athletic administrators and the coaches on this call, is you need to communicate with your student athletes. That's the first thing that I did from a proactive standpoint. I woke up I think it was Saturday morning, when things really were coming to a head. And I also encouraged our commissioner, Mike Oresco, to start looking at some responses. And he had a great response. He said, I'm already starting on that. And so one thing we're doing in the conference is that we're going to form a racial equality action group, which I'm actually going to chair. So that's from more of a national standpoint, but right there on our campus, we immediately started communicating with our student athletes. I'm hearing now across the country that some athletic directors haven't done that. Please push your coaches to do that. It doesn't matter if they have African-American student athletes on their teams or students of color. As Brandy said, these student athletes are very aware of what's going on. Somebody made a comment on a call I was on yesterday that this is the first generation that hasn't had to ask its parents for information. It is out there. It is on the internet. They are very socially conscious, and they want to get involved and they want to do something. Another thing they do expect from us, whether we like it or not, they expect us to make statements. And a former student athlete here of color made some comments to me and said, hey, you need to get something out there. You're being too slow. And I was right in the middle of trying to handle a lot of different things. So I learned that. And so I was glad that he kind of pushed me on that. But then our president made a statement without any prompting from me that I thought was very well spoken and very well thought out. And that helped a lot too. So communicate with your student athletes, listen to them. I've taken lots and lots of notes. We don't have all the answers just because we're African-American. We have to learn too, but communicate with them. And if you haven't, you're way behind right now, so you need to catch up.
Thank you, Derrick. Tim, how about you? What are you doing on your campus?
Yeah, I mentioned earlier that I spoke with our student athletes, and we did it a little bit differently. Dina, Kirsten, and I are the executive team members who are African American, and we talked to our coaches first and told them that we wanted to meet with our African American student athletes first. Just us three with them, to provide them with a safe space to ask questions and just hear us and us hear them, more importantly. And that may not work on every campus, and I get that. But I think it goes to the depth of the relationships that our executive team members have. I don't oversee any sports. None of them report to me. They all report to those individuals. So it allows me to spend time with who I need to when I need to, and not have to worry about new carpet in the locker room. It's actually great quality time. And they handle way larger issues than that, so I'm not trying to make light of it. But they had great relationships with those students. I have great relationships with all students. So we thought for us that made the most sense. So we had a meeting with them and discussed and gave them opportunities. And they wanted, one of the things they said is they wanted to do a video themselves collectively, just to have their voice, because they didn't see a bunch of student athlete videos. They saw some statements by teams, but they didn't see a video that talk about how they feel. So we embraced that, obviously. And then the very next night, we invited all student athletes, coaches, and staff, and had the same conversation. There wasn't anything said that was secret the night before. It was pretty straightforward, and gave them that same opportunity to share, and several staff members shared. And I think that opened up, anytime you're vulnerable, it opens up people that feel a certain way or a connection with you. And I think that helped with our staff members. And I got many messages from our student athletes and staff of support that they appreciated it, even the ones that hadn't spoken, but that's just a start. So we're drafting a plan now of how we're going to enter this entire year, and what our focus is going to be, and how we make that more strategic objectives. And then finally, I'm meeting with SAC next week to propose some of my thoughts to them and see if we can come to an accord about what our steps are as a department, and make sure that we're providing them what they need.
Thanks, Tim. And Candice, anything to add for that from how you're approaching it on your campus?
No, very, very similar. So no, nothing to add. Same.
Okay, thank you. Yes, we've got a lot of questions, Jill, so we're trying to make sure that we maximize this time. So, you've mentioned that you're talking to your student athletes, that they're talking to you. So number one, that's a level of comfort and rapport that you all have. So so happy to hear that, but that is not something that comes natural for everybody. So what advice would you have for administrators? And I'm specifically thinking about athletic directors and coaches, because that's who the student athletes are looking to first, right? To say something, do something. So what do you say to them? What advice would you have about those who might be struggling for where to start with these conversations, how to facilitate them with their student athletes and staff? So Candace, we'll start with you.
I would say that, what we've tried to stress on our campus, starting with our coaches, but also with our staff, is that it's okay to not be perfect with this. So don't let your aspiration to be perfect actually prevent you from having necessary conversations. And if we start with our hearts and your intentions are pure and positive, then you may stumble, but you can stumble your way through it, and kids can see that what your intention is. And so this is not, fortunately, this is not something that you can just put your head in the sand on this or go through the motions, because these kids will hold us accountable to a different level. And I think that that's actually what's going to spark the action that we need to really affect change. And so it's like, ask questions, listen more than you talk, but be willing to engage in the conversation, because I think kids will respect that effort. And you have to educate yourself along the way. You got to get better every time. You got to probe and you got to dig, but be willing to start. I actually think that's the most important thing.
Yes, and I'd like to add to that. Brandy, I'd like to add to that. And that's very important. And for us, obviously, we're former student athletes. We have student athletes on campus now of color. So there is a lot of comfort there both ways, I think. But they want to hear from who we're calling our allies. They know we're going to jump in the middle of these situations. They know that we're going to be on committees. They know that we're going to chair things. They know that we're going to be out there when they march and all those things. They want what I call cross communication. They want to hear from the athletic director. They want to hear from individuals who are white. They want to hear from their white teammates and everybody else that's involved. They want to hear from the strength coaches. Mm-hmm. And so I've learned a lot of those types of things, especially on some of the calls with some of the teams. And even when we think we're communicating, we need to over communicate right now. I can't stress that enough. Over communicate. You do not want to be seen as being tone deaf or ignoring these student athletes right now. And I've even outlined some things to say to other people and start with saying, you know, I really don't know what to say. But I care. I'm very invested in you. And this institution is going to support you. So I want to hear from you. And then again, allow them to do the talking and to lead the monologue.
Thanks, Derrick. Tim, do you want to round us out?
No, let's, I know there's a window that is closing, so let's go. Keep the ball rolling.
Okay, sounds good. This is probably one of my favorite questions, so I'm excited to hear your answers to this. We talk a lot about emotional intelligence and how important that is in the work that we do. But where does cultural intelligence fit into this conversation, considering what we do every day and the people that we serve? So Tim, we'll start with you since you yielded your time for the last question.
Yeah, Brandy, like you, that question is fascinating. And I shared it with a colleague and that's what they said, fascinating. And it really is, because last summer, my first summer here after I arrived, we did a retreat and we spent a lot of time on emotional intelligence, a ton, with our coach, with the entire body, particularly with coaches though, to make sure that they develop those bonds and become intuitive with that type of, with those types of signals. But we didn't spend any time on cultural intelligence. And that to me is fascinating because there are so many differences that we aren't even aware of. And sometimes in our attempt to, I won't say assimilate, but in our attempt to communicate and show a familiarity, we have unknown microaggressions that, you know, can be offensive to people and not even know that. So cultural intelligence is something that I will make sure that not only just continuing to understand the culture that I grew up in and was a part of, but, you know, the culture of our student athletes and where they're coming from and our coaches and generational, and there's a lot to consider there, but it is fascinating. And I haven't spent nearly as much time as I will over the next weeks and months. So thank you for developing that question for us.
Thanks, Tim. Candice?
I agree with Tim.
That's a great question, Brandy. I almost got you to take it off before we did, but I think when I did a little bit more research on it, I think I even learned a little bit more about cultural intelligence. A quick story. I was with our basketball team at UConn during the season, and we were on a roll, and Frank Hayes done a great job. You know, we won our first regular season conference championship this year, and we were at UConn, a very tough place to play, and we ended up beating them in overtime. And we came off the floor and everybody was jubilant, as you can imagine, and you know, who's next and all those things. And somebody walked into the locker room and said that they heard that Kobe Bryant had died in a plane, in a helicopter crash a couple of hours prior to that. And that locker room went from being as jubilant as possible to, it was almost someone's funeral. I'm talking about guys crying, guys who were just despondent, didn't know what to do with themselves. And what I learned right on the spot was that guy was a cultural icon to a lot of people, but to that generation, Kobe Bryant to them was like my Michael Jordan, like a lot of our Michael Jordan. And so I learned a lot, and so I had to dial things down and stop worrying about the championship and really jump in and try to understand where they were, because it was a somber time, a very emotional time going back home in a time where it should have been very jubilant. And so I realized that even myself, being African-American like a lot of them, there's still some generational things from a cultural standpoint that we need to grasp.
Yeah, thank you, Derrick. And you know, I appreciate the vulnerability too, and the willingness to admit that there are areas that we all still need to learn and grow in, right? Like that's the beauty about being in the higher educational system. And with that, there are a lot of folks out there asking, well, how do I learn more? How can I contribute? What can I do? And I see some answers, well, stop asking Black people and do your own research. But if that is the answer that we're giving, what is some of the advice that you have for people who are looking for where they can start to do their part and to learn a little bit more about what's going on around them? So Candace, we're gonna start with you since you quasi-yielded your last comment.
I just gave credit because I thought the answer was fantastic. I think, one benefit of being on a college campus is that we have access to experts in so many different areas. I mean, we probably don't do as good of a job as we should at accessing these resources that are right there at our disposal. So, I mean, there are professors on your campus who are talking about this. There are podcasts you can listen to. There are all kinds of efforts that are happening right within your community. And I think it's not for lack of having access to resources. You just have to be intentional about using them. And so I would start right there on campus. I imagine everybody has like a chief diversity officer or maybe soon to be chief social justice officer. We all have, that was a joke. I know we can't see pretend. But my point in all seriousness though is that we have great access to knowledge right within our communities and even starting on their campuses. And I think that's a great place to start.
Thank you, Candace. Tim?
Yeah, real quickly, there are a ton of resources. I've started to send videos and book recommendations to people. I've received 2 books in the last couple of days, Race Talks and White Fragility, that I'm anxiously awaiting to start reading. And then a number of videos, and then just with my own kids. I have a soon-to-be freshman in college in the fall. So I have an 18-year-old, a 14-year-old, and a 12-year-old. And we've watched videos. We watched a systemic racism video on YouTube the other night. We watched a video, Black Protest, White Riots, that was very interesting from the media's perceptions of 2 similar events and how the language surrounds that. And then we've also started this summer series of watching historical documentaries on African Americans. And last Sunday was James Baldwin, which was very, very fascinating because he was friends with Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King. And this Sunday, I think, is going to be Emmett Till's story. So that'll be a little bit difficult, but they need to understand their perspective.
Thanks, Tim. Derrick, you want to round us out?
I'll round it out quickly. My president, who's doing a great job, she actually forwarded me a TED Talk. And if you email me, I will forward it to all of you. I can't remember the name of the gentleman who did it. He's a Black gentleman that basically talked about some of these same things and some of the same things that we deal with. Extraordinary. My wife is going to kill me, but she's a great writer. She does children's books, and not that you try to capitalize off a crisis is what I call it. But and Tim mentioned this. Another thing, if you haven't seen Tim's video that we referred to at the beginning, that about 25,000 people across the country have seen, please check that out. It's only 3 minutes, but very powerful. But he mentioned my wife's book, which is called Mama, Did You Hear the News? And it's really about educating young people of color on what they should do when they encounter the police. Very even book. And it's something that she did years ago, but it's getting a lot more attention right now because of what we're going through. But it's a great, powerful tool. And it's not just for children. I encourage people, parents, to read it, everybody of all ages, all nationalities. And I think it'd be a great educational tool for a lot of people.
Thank you. Appreciate that. And I know that the video is going to be posted at some point next week, I believe. So if we have enough time between the 4 of us, I'm sure we can pull together some of these different suggestions too, and we can include that. We'll see if that's, Will has the ability to include that when he posts the video. So I wanted to shift for a minute and get your perspective on some reactions that we received from attending the national forum that was co-hosted by the University of Oklahoma and Kansas State. It was a really well done forum, so many different folks from so many different walks of life. But they sent us in the recap some quotes from the student athletes that attended. So I want to put these up on the screen and just, I'll read the first three here and then read the others that are on the next screen. And then I'd like to get their response from our panel. So the first is, student athletes should judge their institution, coaches, and teammates based on their reaction to evaluate if that's a place, coach, or teammate that they would want to continue to compete for. Another is, trust needs to be built prior to a crisis. And conversations need to happen across the department within individual teams and as an entire athletics program. And then Laura, if you wouldn't mind going back one slide, please. And then we'll get the previous, the other quotes were, it's like they value our bodies for sport, but outside of that, they don't value our bodies or our mental health. No one cares about us off the court, no coaches, teammates, administrators. And then the last is, the impact of reaching out shows that you are valued, that someone non-Black is in your corner. It helps you feel like you are not alone. So these are some powerful quotes that were extracted from that symposium and shared with those that attended across the country. What are some of your reactions to that? Tim, we'll start with you.
Well, all four of us were student athletes at the Division I level. So I, for one, know exactly how that is. And one of the reasons why I became an athletic director, and I've said this before, so forgive me if you heard it, but when I was a student athlete, our athletic director only talked to me about basketball. I realized I wasn't very good, and it was probably more interesting to talk to Penny Hardaway or Elliot Perry or somebody, but he never talked to me anything about more than basketball. So when I became an athletic director, I wanted to develop relationships with all of our student athletes. And that's one of the reasons why there hasn't been back in football since my first stop, because it takes so much of your time. I want to make sure that I'm developing great relationships with our cross-country students, our tennis students, with all of them. And I feel I'm able to do that a lot better without having that. But I felt that when I was a student athlete, and I don't want any of our student athletes to feel that way. So I definitely understand where those statements came from.
Thanks, Tim. Candice?
I guess I would just add that, clearly we've got a lot more work to do. I think that the panelists here, I think we all understand the importance of building trust and supporting young people beyond just the sport that they play, right? And not just seeing them as that sport, right? Or just as an athlete, but I think by and large, it just shows us that as an enterprise, we have a lot more work to do. And the thing is, it has to be a call to action, because kids are not going to allow that to go on anymore. I feel confident about that. Like, if you're not in this to support young people and truly affect change, then I don't think there'll be a place for you in this. And the tide is shifting, and we should be responsive to that. Those kids, it should embarrass all of us that kids would say things like that.
Yeah, thank you, Candace. And Derrick?
Right. And like Tim mentioned, and Tim, I commend you, because honestly, and this works both ways, I didn't even know who the athletic director was when I played football at Vanderbilt. I really didn't. Came to be that it was Roy Kramer for 2 years, and then it was Paul Houlihan. I got to know him after I started working there, so I'm glad that I created a relationship with him. But this is the same thing. This doesn't surprise me. This is the same type of conversation we would have had 30 years ago when I played ball. But now, as I tell our staff, and I've told a lot of people when I present to coaches groups, that when we play ball, if the coach told us to run through a wall, we just ran through the wall. If you ask a kid to run through a wall today, they'll run up to, they're bigger than us, they're faster, they're stronger. So they'll get to the wall faster, but they'll stop. And then they'll say, hey, coach, you know, this wall is made out of brick. You know, can I go around it? Can I go over it? Can I go under it? So they analyze things totally different than we do. And they are holding us accountable. I'm telling you, when you dialogue with these student athletes, you need to take what they say very seriously. And here's another analogy that I'll use. They have a lot of power. And we're looking forward to football season, and we're looking forward to having our student athletes back on campus in a couple of weeks. I know some of your student athletes are already there, but they're already mentioning, well, these people, they haven't asked me about how I was doing while I was gone, when I was back in the neighborhood, all those things. And so you need to address these things so you don't have to address them on September 5th, because we all kick off on September 5th, hopefully, depending on where we are. And you have to prepare yourself for maybe pregame demonstrations, protests, all kinds of different things. So that's another thing that we're talking about. But imagine if we're warming up for football, we go back in the locker room, all of us, September 5th, and then when it's time to run back out there and play, these student athletes stand up and say, you know what, coach, we're not going back out there. That's what we're dealing with here. So you have to take it very seriously. A lot of these kids are in pain. They can relate to what happened to these people because they've been there. A lot of them have had bad run-ins with police, and they expect us not only to address it, but to take some action steps. So I'm encouraging everybody to do that.
Thank you. Thank you for all of your perspectives on that. And again, you know, Candace, to your point, just the fact that these are things that are being said should be alarming to all of us across the board, because it's definitely, obviously not the way that we want our student athletes to feel, but we also need to stop for a minute and make sure that we're just not checking boxes as administrators to get to the next thing, especially in this space. And we're all dealing with the pandemic, but there is a certain demographic of the people we serve and the people we work with who, on top of the pandemic, are dealing with the stresses of racial injustice. And that could have been me, or it could have been a family member, or just triggers from what may have happened in their past. So we definitely have to pause and think about some of those things as we conduct ourselves and continue to build relationships with these student athletes, because they will hold you accountable. They'll tell you no new friends in a minute. So we definitely need to make sure that we keep those genuine conversations going. Candace, I know that we are going to lose you because you have to get back to your duties as an athletic director here in a few minutes. I want to ask one more question while you're here with us, and then we'll continue with Derrick and Tim. But, you know, how can we, I'm fusing together a question that we had previously discussed and that you all are prepared for, and one that's been asked in the chat. So the question in the chat was surrounding, you know, how do you handle and how do you teach your student athletes, your coaches, and your staff to prepare themselves for what they're going to hear from students on campus and from professors on campus who may not feel that this social justice movement is needed or necessary. They may be the all lives matter people. So how do we best serve each other as administrators on campus, and how do we best prepare our student athletes to respond to any negativity that they may experience when they return back to our campuses in the fall? Candace, I'll start with you since you'll have to go soon.
I think it's a really good question. And look, this work is not for the faint, right? For the faint of heart. And so I think part of it is that whether we're talking about racial injustice or otherwise, we're always equipping student athletes to overcome and to deal with naysayers, or to be nimble in how they approach things. This is no different. I think we have to be willing to stand with them and to support them, even or especially when it gets tough. And you know, as Black leaders, like for those of us on the panel, we have to do that every day. You know, it's part of what we contend with all the time. And so, you know, I think there's some wisdom or some insight that we could pass down to young people to help prepare them for what is to come. But, you know, it's not going to happen overnight. But ideally, right, the culture shifts. And so there are more allies and there are more support. And then if you are if you don't support, then you're the outlier, right? That shows us that the culture is sort of changing in favor of supporting people. But again, I go back to the initial concept of we have to be willing to talk about like what it is, We have to be willing to talk about race. We have to be willing to talk about how we got here. It does not mean that I'm trying to discount you, but I am trying to say that there are people, back to your concept of equity, that don't have a fair start, or they have more obstacles in their path. We got to call it what it is. And I think, I mean, that is, I know that a lot of us are very, very focused on action. I mean, we all are. We're action oriented. We're competitive. This is what we do. But some of this has to be about like peeling back the layers and being very foundational. And so that we all understand exactly what we're talking about, because you cannot gloss over this. And it's scary and it's uncomfortable, but you know, we can't afford to be naive about this anymore. And I think we can do this together, but it's going to be hard work. I think we just have to be really, really upfront about that. It's going to be hard work, and our kids are going to need us. And I think, you know, I guess the last thing I would say is that it's part of the challenge of being like Black in these roles, because you have to emotionally be in balance yourself so that you can support and lead all of these people. And that is more than a notion.
Mm-hmm.
So I really do appreciate this space. I hope we can continue having more conversations. Derrick and Tim and Brandy, I thank you for all your words. And I learned a lot, as always, when I'm around you. And I really, really appreciate it. And I got to go to a meeting with the chancellor. I would stay, but you know, you got to go. You got to, when the boss calls, you got to go. So
That's
I
right.
really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Candace. And again, congratulations.
Thank you.
Tim, do you want to follow up with some of your thoughts about how we better serve each other, but how we also prepare our student athletes for what they may encounter on campus, whether it be a faculty member or another student of the general population, a fan? How would you approach that?
Yeah, I think Candace hit the nail on the head when she said that a lot of us are used to having these types of battles on campus anyway. So our student, and then I've worked at HBCU when if you lose a game, you know, students are, you know, talking bad to you about just losing the game. So I think student athletes they're probably a little bit more adept to having some of this than some of us. But I think what we need to do, I think that it has to be a conscious effort now to realize that on a college campus, you're going to have diversity of thought. And, you know, sometimes it plays in your favor. And right now the wind is blowing toward the way of African Americans and people who support racial equality and social justice. But there are a considerable amount of people that don't feel that way as well. So we just have to remember, you know, all of the things that we can take from being on the court or on the field or track and utilize those lessons to stay focused. Remember, stay on messaging. A lot of them get PR training. Stay on messaging. Stay on point. Don't allow someone to distract you from your cause or your message, and be professional at all times. I think those are the couple of qualities that will remind student athletes of.
Thank you, Tim. Dr. Gragg?
I'll add a little bit to that. We believe in education, and I tell student athletes all the time, know the issues before you just follow the crowd. If you're going to protest lawfully. Don't do anything that will misrepresent yourself, your family, or this institution, first and foremost. So we have a lot of talks about that. We can't control what people say on campus. There are a lot of varying opinions. That's why you want to have these conversations. And there are varying opinions in the locker room. You need to get at the heart of some of that. Because what goes on off the fields and off the court, it translates onto how these people perform, what they're going through mentally and all those things. And so what we can't do in athletics, though, whether we're Black or white administrators or coaches, is do not attempt to change the narrative. If you have a Black Matters movement going on and that's what the narrative is, when you counter that with all lives matter, you have lost those student athletes. I think in our world, it's inherent that all lives matter. Maybe they should have added 2 at the end of Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter 2, and maybe that would be a little bit more digestible to some people. But what I want is a society where we don't even have to say Black Lives Matter, and that's just taken for granted also. So don't change the narrative. Try to understand it, educate yourself again, and dialogue with student athletes.
Thank you. So we've We've had a lot of questions. We've had a lot of dialogue. I'm surprised that we've only had 2 questions. And the other question is along those lines, but I'm going to put a twist on it. So, George, if you're out there and you hear me say bits and pieces of your question, I'm with you, brother, but I'm just trying to add to it. So, he's talking about these Black student athletes that are going to be coming back to us on campus are going to be a little different arriving than they were when they left, based on what's happened, what kind of personal leadership they've grown in. So how do you prepare your staff, and how are you preparing yourselves to welcome them back in, knowing that their expectation is going to be different in terms of how they're treated or what is being tolerated? So what are some thoughts there in terms of being prepared for some of these younger people who are a little more woke, as the young folks say? Tim, we'll start with you.
I think that, well, I know we've talked to our coaches just about the student athlete voice is as powerful as it's ever been. From all the legislation that is going around here to, the most recent, these most recent conversations. And then the Black student athletes are feeling like they have a voice for uniquely one of the first times ever. So it goes down, everything boils down to relationships. And maybe that's my fundraising background, I'm not sure. But if you have great relationships, it helps solve a lot of these problems, or at least it doesn't solve the problems. It allows you to reach or get to a common ground. Because I think in being here in New Orleans and watching this Drew Brees and the Saints dynamic, everything, it's easy to say that their team is going to be fractured, but it depends on the strength of relationships that Drew Brees has in that room. And you just have to understand here, he's pretty iconic. Everyone knows that, how the Saints have captured not only America's heart, but particularly the people here after Katrina. And he embodies that most closely. So he went from walking on water to F Drew Brees in a protest overnight. So it depends on the strength of the true relationships that they have in that locker room to see if they implode or they use this to build. And that's how I look at it with our student athletes coming to campus. And that's why I try to remind our coaches and staff that relationships that we have with kids, and as Dr. Gragg said earlier, if you love them up, then they will still run through that wall. You have to love them up and tell them why, and how is this going to help you be a better X player. You have to do that, and you have to love them up off the court and off the field and off the track as much or more than you do when you're coaching them hard. It's directly proportional, in my opinion. So I think it all boils down to relationships.
Thank you, Tim. Derrick?
Now, I'll add a little bit to that. Usually every team, football, basketball, whatever it is, they have several conscientious brothers on the team. And those are the ones that you probably need to engage first. And you all know who they are on your own individual team. Sometimes they're a little bit more outspoken. Maybe they've had some parental or other guidance in their lives before they arrive on your campus. They're well schooled on a lot of the issues. And so engage them first, because they usually have the pulse of the team. And the other teammates are probably going to follow them. Luckily for us, Chris Paul is a young man on our football team. Chris is an outstanding individual. Not only is he a starter on our offensive line, he's the president of our SAC group. He's the president of the SAC within the conference, and he sits on the national SAC board. So I dialogue with him, as you can imagine, a lot. I'm going to get him involved in some other things that are going on campus. Another thing you shouldn't be afraid of is to sometimes what we created when I first got here was called the Black Men's Initiative. And it got a little pushback in the beginning because, well, why would you segregate a certain subset of student athletes? And I said, well, they have a different experience. I noticed that they just do. And so at this institution, before I arrived, I noticed some of the deficiencies in graduation and retention. And when I wrote my dissertation, I wrote it on factors that positively affect the graduation and retention rates for Black football players in the SEC at the time. Because I was a product, and I was at the product of Vanderbilt, and I was a graduate student at the University of Arkansas, so it made sense. But I have a lot of information that translates across the board. And so one of the things that I picked up on, one of the themes is that a lot of those men were in fraternities, just like I am, just like Tim is. We're in the same historically Black fraternity, Kappa Alpha Psi, and that adds a support system to your normal athletic life. And you start to become competitive with those guys. You don't want to pull the chapter average down. You don't want to be labeled as the jock. One of our main themes here is we want you to integrate into mainstream campus society and become something other than a jock. And so with this Black Men's Initiative group, starting it 6 years ago, I had no idea that they would just take it and run with it. Now it's a recognized organization on campus. They get some funding, they have a crest, they have t-shirts. And I don't have to show up nearly as much as I did at the outset, but I still do. And the things that they discuss Kobe Bryant dying. They discuss dating. They discuss sexual violence and assault and those types of things. And so don't be afraid to, again, engage that group. Don't be afraid to sometimes pull them aside because they are dealing with things a little bit differently. And again, it goes back to relationships and communication.
Thank you so much, Derrick. Y'all, time flies when you're talking about things that matter in the world. So we only have 3 minutes left. Will, I'm gonna start a petition that we need to have a part 2. There are so many questions that have populated. So y'all, I'm sorry that I can't get to them, but I do want to end with this. We were gonna talk about a call to action, but I think you all have given us a lot of different things that we can all do on our campuses and with our student athletes and with each other. So what would each of you like to leave us with today? At this point, I'm sorry, but y'all got about a minute each. But what is it that you want people to walk away with today? Tim?
Many of you don't know that my background, I worked at R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company when Winston was the sponsor for Winston Cup with NASCAR. So I worked on NASCAR, so I want to take a moment to commend them for outlawing the Confederate flag at racetracks. I worked many of those racetracks and saw way too many. So I'm really happy that they've gotten that symbol of hate out of that sport. But I'd like to end by saying that I think most of this comes down to relationships. You have to have solid relationships. And if your relationships aren't strong enough, if they are strong enough and you don't know something, just be vulnerable and say you don't know. But provide student athletes with an audience to listen and tell them that you don't know, but you want to help. And then whatever you tell them, please do that. Or tell them why you can't do it, because they're going to hold your feet to the fire. As we can see from many issues popping up around the country, the student athletes are holding their administrators and their coaches' feet to the fire if they aren't doing what they say they were doing. So ask the question, listen, be vulnerable, and then follow through.
Thanks, Tim. Derrick?
And I'll end quickly. And again, a lot of us don't know what to say, but you have to say something. And that I'll end with that. And they will, and again, what Tim said, follow through with what you said that you were going to do. Listen to them, take some direction from them, get with your coaches, and other administrators, devise some type of action plan. If you have historical sites in your city, or if you're close to Washington, D.C. and can go to the African American Museum, and don't just take the Black players, take everybody. Have some team bonding around some of these things, dialogue a lot more, but you can't stay silent on this one. They're not going to allow it.
Thank you. So that is our time, folks. Again, I'd like to thank Candace. I know she had to step off, but would like to thank Candace, Tim, and Derrick for taking the time out to have this really important conversation. Will, thank you for, again, providing this platform for us to be able to do this. I was kidding, but not kidding on part 2. So if you want to do it, we're down, we'll figure it out. And then to all of you who logged in, thank you so much for watching. You can find all of our information on our respective websites. I'm going to speak for the panel, but to say if you have questions or whatever, I mean, that's what we're all here for, is to help each other, to support each other. So I hope you walked away with something that you didn't know today. And yes, Tim, you have something else you want to say?
Yeah, Brenda, you were amazing. It was awesome.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
To work on this panel. You did a tremendous job, and I can't wait to see you in this chair where you belong.
Ooh, don't put that on me, but thank you. I appreciate that. This was easy. Y'all are fantastic. I appreciate your leadership, even though I don't work for you directly. We see you, we thank you for paving the way, leading the way. We said this to some of our kids on our student athlete panel. We understand that you can't be what you can't see. So thank you for being visible. Thank you for being vulnerable, and thank you for being available. And again, Will, thank you very much, and we hope you all have a great weekend.